Did you know if you put stuff in the wrong spots, you don't get the performance that you paid for? Today we're going to talk about PCI Express lanes, a discussion that has been taking place since PCI Express started many years ago. But it's finally coming to a point to where you actually are impacting performance, not just of your GPU, but of your drives, and you're throwing money down the drain if you're not setting your system up properly. Introducing the XTM3 from Fantex, micro ATX chassis built for power and performance. Compact yet packed with potential, the XTM3 features support for rear connect motherboards, dedicated radiator space at the top, and triple fan locations at the bottom to help keep your GPU cool. With its innovative layout and sleek, clean design, the XTM3 is ready to take on almost any gaming PC configuration and cooling challenge. Check out the link in the description for more details. Okay, so today we're going to talk about PCI Express lanes because it matters today because when Gen 5 first came out a few years back, it didn't matter so much because GPUs were not Gen 5 yet. They were Gen 4 still. Like 4090s were Gen 4 by 16, and that was where they maxed out. So it didn't matter. The only things that were actually using Gen 5, like the bandwidth of Gen 5 and had a true tangible performance impact was NVMEs. Now NVMe Gen 5 drives are prevalent. They've come down in price significantly, so more people are running them, which is leading to post after post after post on anywhere you go where you talk about people building their systems and they just are not that familiar with this subject are going, why is my GPU only running at Gen 5 by 8 and not Gen 5 by 16? It is a Gen 5 by 16 graphics card. Why is it not giving me the full 16? And what actually triggered me doing this video today was not that discussion, which I've seen come up a million times on Discord, on Reddit, on PC Enthusiasts and Builder Facebook group. We recently did this retro build behind me, which is going to sleep right now. And that is a 5060 Ti 8GB card. Yeah, it's 8GB. I know they shouldn't exist. But for this build, we wanted a cheap graphics card that would take us through all consoles up to PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4 even, but still be able to transition into PC gaming and not leave a ton of performance on the table, allowing us to play a lot of PC games as well up to modern titles without completely breaking the bank. The build was about $1,000. Anyway, I digress. That card has a by 8x slot. The actual pins on there is a by 8. It's half the length of a normal 16. And that's because of the fact that it kind of forces your bifurcation and your motherboard to not utilize a Gen 5 by 16 if the pins are there even, because there's no point. There's absolutely no performance gain on any mid-range graphics card at all. Anything under like a 5080 is not going to notice a change of Gen 5 by 16 to a Gen 5 by 8. 5090, however, can and does. Now this discussion is specifically, it's gonna really include those people that are running like 5090s, and trust me, there's a lot of them out there. You might be surprised, there's a lot of people running that. But this discussion comes up a lot because it can still happen on older systems that are only Gen 4, but the discussion is exactly the same concept here. So we're gonna apply it today to Gen 5, but the truth, this can also be true for anyone running Gen 4 motherboards with Gen 4 graphics cards and Gen 4 drives. It's just, you've got to kind of look at the manual and figure out what your bifurcation is going to end up being. Now this video is not about bifurcation. We'll do a separate one about that. This is about understanding PCI Express lanes, which is nothing more than the highway system that takes all of the devices plugged into your motherboard and makes them communicate with your CPU. So they're nothing more than communication highways. And then the generation and the lanes just determines basically how fast the highway speeds are and how many lanes on that highway are available to things communicating with the CPU. So let's go ahead and start with the nuances here. This is where the discussion of AMD versus Intel really started way back in the day. I'm talking like, we got to go back to like X99, probably even X58 to be honest, but X99 and X299 when Intel and Ryzen were just and I say Ryzen, obviously the Ryzen platform and architecture within the AMD CPU system. This is where the battle really started. The first thing that AMD really offered the consumer was more PCI Express lanes. Because Intel is stingy. They are still stingy with PCI Express lanes. Why? I don't know. In fact, I remember there were so many videos in Computex back in like 2017, 2016, around there, talking about why is Intel putting PCI Express lanes like behind a paywall? Well, because they wanted you to buy the Extreme platform, like the X99, X299, to get those more lanes. So on their consumer grade CPUs, like their Z series CPUs, like the 4790K, the 7600K, whatever, 70, I don't remember the numbers, they're so old now. But those had such limited PCI Express lanes that the moment you put your graphics card in your motherboard, they were all used up. Everything else had to go through PCH and go through the chipset. But now, AMD, they made sure that when their CPUs first came out, that they were offering more lanes than Intel. And that became a story that holds true today. For instance, the Intel 14900K, it says Core Ultra, but I don't have the box of the 14900K. But that is like the last Intel CPU that anyone cared about. And then we know how that went, obviously, with the corrosion issues and then the early degradation issues, where Intel was under so much pressure to try and stay ahead of AMD that they kind of created a Wild West with motherboard manufacturers, and they were pushing the CPU so hard out of the box without even touching any settings that they were degrading within a year. We've experienced a couple of those around here actually that have degraded. But I digress. The amount of lanes on the Intel CPU, we'll refer 14900K by the way, is 16 Gen 5 lanes to the CPU with 4 Gen 4 lanes to the CPU for your NVMe. So what does that mean? Let's assume this motherboard right here, which is an X670E Tai-Chi. Let's pretend this is an Intel motherboard. You've got your CPU plugged in, you've got your GPU slotted, and then obviously the top slot right here. And you'll notice, you can always tell, by the way, on your motherboard, which NVMe slot is like the direct to CPU lanes, because it's always gonna be above the slot 1 PCI Express slot. So NVMe's are also PCI Express because they're taking up PCI Express lanes to the CPU. So anyway, if let's say we took my 5090 right here, which is a Gen 5 by 16, your 5080 is also a Gen 5 by 16, and you throw it in the top slot, you've got all 16 of your Gen 5 lanes now set up to the CPU. That's fine. You're going to GPU-Z and you'll see Gen 5 by 16. But if you don't put a Gen 4 drive in the top slot, you put a Gen 5 drive, let's say you spent 5090 money, you're gonna probably buy a Gen 5 drive. Let's say this is a Crucial T710, not sponsored or anything, I just grabbed it off the shelf as a prop. If we plug this Gen 5 drive into our top slot, guess what's gonna happen? It's gonna drop our Gen 5 by 16 graphics card more than likely down to a Gen 5 by 8. Now how the bifurcation works is gonna kind of be on a motherboard by motherboard basis. Definitely check the manual for your motherboard. It should have a chart that shows you the different, it's kind of like the RAM. It shows which RAM slots things go in. It'll also tell you the priority to put certain drives in which slots and what the speed's effect will be on the other devices if you obviously use up all of your lanes, because we've got, like I said, 16x Gen 5 to the CPU, 4x Gen 4 to the CPU for 20 total lanes. Everything else that's plugged in here, whether it be network card, capture card, more NVMe's, then go through the chipset, okay? So obviously, if you bought a Gen 5 drive and throw it in a Gen 4 slot, you're only gonna get Gen 4 speeds, which is not gonna be the 14,500 megahertz, and this sounds sponsored, I swear to God it's not, but it's not gonna be the 14,500 megabytes of read speed that you see on this drive. That requires Gen 5 by 4. You're gonna get Gen 4 speeds, which will probably drop it down to about the 7,000 to 7,500 megabytes per second speed, which is half what you paid for. So why? That's why we're making this video. I want people to be aware that you gotta know how your system is allocating speeds and bifurcating so that you can make sure you're not throwing money away, but also not set it up incorrectly. Now this is where AMD, even today, has definitely kept the consumer loyalty, if you will, because there are 24 lanes in a 9950X3D, 9800X3D. Check your CPU too, there might be less lanes for smaller CPUs. Sometimes they slice them up. I believe AMD is 24 down the grid, I believe. I could be wrong. Intel definitely chops them up as you go down the stack. But on an AM5 Ryzen CPU, a modern Ryzen CPU, especially Zen 5, you get 16x Gen 5 to the CPU, you get 4x Gen 5 to the CPU for your first NVMe. Then you get a Gen 4 4x to the CPU for your second drive. So that scenario I just described is already better than Intel because you could put your full-size 5090 in there. By full size, I mean you're getting Gen 5 by 16. You can throw your T710 or any other Gen 5, like a 990 Pro or whatever other drive you want in there. It's gonna be running Gen 5 4X. I don't have another drive here, but you can now take another Gen 4 drive and stick it anywhere on the motherboard, and then it will stay at Gen 4 by 4 for its full advertised speed. But if you throw a third drive in there, now bifurcation is going to take place where it's got to start chopping up those lanes. Now I will do another video about bifurcation. Your motherboard handles it automatically, but I only want to do the video as an explainer so that you guys can understand why, if you're looking at GPU-Z, CPU-Z, and you're seeing these different speeds listed, why you're seeing them listed that way. But on a high level, if you take a full-size 16x slot, that's anything that has a slot this big right here available to it. Graphics cards are usually the only thing that will be that wide. Usually you'll see either a 1X, which is a really small one, or a 4X, which is a little bit longer, or the 8X, which, like I said, is the newer 8X graphics cards, which aren't using a full-size slot. Those have to be chopped up and those lanes have to be reallocated to different communication. So this really comes in if you're using like an expansion card for, let's say, adding even more NVMe drives to a system, a la Asus coming with like the DIMM.2 deal that you could put anywhere between 2 and sometimes 4 additional NVMEs on there. Although the connection might be proprietary to the way it slots into the motherboard, it is not proprietary in the way it talks to the CPU. That still uses PCI Express lanes. But you can't, let's say you take an expansion card, let's pretend this is an NVMe expansion card right here. And I've got 2 drives on here, right? So let's pretend there's 2 drives, and I slot it into this bottom PCI Express slot. Those drives cannot share the same lanes in communication. They have to be divided. Okay, that's the bifurcation. On a high level, if you've got a 16x slot, it can be bifurcated in 3 different ways. You can have the 1 by 16, right? So 1 communication device at 16x, or split it to 2 8x or 4 4x. This is why if you were to now go into the Intel scenario where you have your GPU on there and you add a second drive and it reduces the bandwidth of your top slot for your graphics card from a Gen 5 by 16 to a Gen 5 by 8, that's because it split it into the 2 by 8s, and then those 8 lanes are allocated to the other NVMe devices to be able to communicate with the CPU. Even if you only added 1 drive that uses 4x, it's still going to steal 8x or 8 lanes from the GPU. If you just put 1 drive in there that uses 4x, you don't drop down to like a 12x. That doesn't exist. It's either 1 16, 2 8s, or 4 4s. And then if you're only using 4, or like 1 of the 3 4s, let's say, for instance, and the GPU is using the other 2 for 8x, you have a 4x just sitting there. It doesn't get like allocated to the GPU somehow. It's only by fact like totals of 8 or individually 4. So I would have 4 sitting there doing nothing. That's a bifurcation video though. We'll talk about that separately in a more depth and better understanding than me probably confusing you right now. But it's basically stealing and chopping up lanes to have communication with your other devices. So this is where it's actually kind of nice to think about the fact that AMD is just the extra 4 lanes. Just the extra Gen 4 lanes makes such a big difference when it comes to the difference between Intel and AMD. Those 4 lanes, man, it keeps you from, you can add another drive and not cut the bandwidth available to your GPU in half, because Gen 5 by 16 is 64 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. And when you drop it down to Gen 5 by 8, it's 32. Now, you can technically drop it down to Gen 4 and keep it by 16, but Gen 4 by 16 is the exact same bandwidth and speed as Gen 5 by 8. So just leave it at Gen 5 by 8. This conversation confuses so many people when they're new to PC building, but it's just understanding the division and the allocation of those lanes. Now, obviously, if you exceed what the CPU is capable of handling by just, let's say I put all 4 NVMEs in here, I've got my GPU in there, I've got a capture card down there, it's going to then overflow those other devices through the chipset, which is not going to have as much bandwidth or speed, I should say, not bandwidth, but speed to the CPU, because it's getting handled by the chipset, and that adds some additional time and latency and overhead. So that's why if you have a drive that you see on the box, it's advertised at these speeds, and it's down in this lower section, you got all this stuff in your system, you're like, why am I not getting these speeds? Well, because these are like the perfect ideal world that's on the box. But careful though, you might start getting sued for this, like Corsair on their box when it comes to RAM speeds, and every other brand that's now basically exposed to that lawsuit. Now, fortunately, it's not all doom and gloom. Let's say you have your 5080 or your 5090 or your 4080 or 4090, right? Those are Gen 4 devices, and if you're running Gen 3 stuff, it's the exact same discussion. It's just back one generation, okay? But let's just say in a perfect world, you've spent thousands of dollars on your GPU and you throw it in there, and you spend a lot of money on a high-end NVMe and you throw it in there, and then you put another drive in there, or a couple drives or something, right? You add any other device on there and it starts to bifurcate, and you see that your graphics card's running at Gen 5 by 8. It sounds like, oh my God, I've cut my performance in half on my GPU. Fortunately, we're not at a point where GPUs are fast enough, even something like a 5090, to where you're gonna really notice any of that performance impact. In fact, it has been tested into the ground. It is tested every single time new product comes out and a new generation of PCI Express comes out. The impact is minimal. We're talking maybe 2%. I think some of the highest percentage of hit I've seen is into the 3% range of your overall FPS. It's not gonna really start to show its ugly head further until graphics cards get even ridiculously faster to saturate the lanes even more in terms of how much bandwidth they need for communication with the CPU. Still, leaving any performance on the table that you paid for sucks, but this is still the limitation of the manufacturers and designers of CPUs in having such low lane counts. This is why back in the day, Intel really leaned on the X99, X299, I don't remember the exact lane counts, but I think Threadripper had 64. I believe Threadripper had 64 lanes, and X299 or whatever still only had, I think it was 24 at the time, or maybe 28. I think it was 28 lanes at the time. So think about the fact that here we are in 2025 now. It's 10 years after those platforms even launched or kind of died for Intel and then picked up more for AMD, speaking of Threadripper, that we still only have 20 and 24. Right? And especially with the amount of NVMe slots that are available on motherboards now, it'd be nice to see an AMD CPU for the consumer grade that has 28 lanes, because that would then allow us to add even another drive to our system, right? To go from 24 to 28, because NVMe's are 4X, to most of them are 4X, number 2. Anyway, I digress. To not have to have bifurcation take place and start stealing lanes from other slots because one more drive is now supported. So now you could have 3 drives installed on an AMD system, ideally with a 28 lane CPU, before you start to even drop the PCI Express slot, the full 16X slot, down to an 8X. The ideal setup is going to depend on what platform you're on, obviously. We've already talked about the differences between AMD and Intel on modern CPUs. You get 4 additional Gen 4 lanes on AMD. AMD is going to be the most ideal, obviously, because the whole landscape has changed. Even if you're not talking X3D, most people are building AMD systems today. It's crazy to see how much that market share has actually changed. So if you're on an AMD setup, check your motherboard. You want to make sure that you understand and check the manual for your motherboard. Those manuals are available online, even if you're standing right there in Micro Center. I wouldn't even take the word for the Micro Center employee, I'll be honest. There's just too many different variations between motherboards and how the lane splitting works. Check the manual online, and then it will tell you what the ideal setup is and the setup at which it's going to start dropping and stealing lanes and applying it to other things. But on a surface level, it's safe to say I recommend going with the biggest, fastest gen your board can support for NVMe. For instance, a 4 terabyte NVMEs are not cheap, but they're definitely cheaper than they used to be. I would take a single 4 terabyte Gen 5 in that dedicated Gen 5 slot rather than getting two terabyte drives. Unless you're gonna do a 2 terabyte Gen 5 and then a 2 terabyte Gen 4, because they're still dedicated lanes to the CPU without going through the chipset, without slowing down your Gen 5 slot. If you are running an older graphics card that is still Gen 4, then it kind of doesn't matter at that point. You could run 4 drives in there and you'd still be able to run your Gen 4 drive at 16X. If you're running Intel, don't even bother with a Gen 5 NVMe drive. Now, that's on 14900K. Core Ultra is a little different. Core Ultra does have more lanes for Gen 5, but no one's really building Core Ultra systems today So I'm kind of just omitting it, okay? It's like they improved in other areas, but then they kind of like reverted, or they kind of regressed in their CPU performance when it comes to games. So those other areas kind of don't matter at this point because it's not a reason for people to buy it. The gaming performance is, if we're talking to gaming builders, and that's just not Core Ultra. So if you have an older 14th or 13th gen system, a single Gen 4 drive with your GPU, that's kind of it. Beyond that, it's gonna start stealing lanes from your GPU, and it's gonna start moving those lanes through the PCI Express or the PCH as well, or the chipset. So AMD still definitely kind of wins in this category, but we will do a whole nother video explaining bifurcation and what it means. That again is just, that's the division, the allocation of those lanes to other devices. It happens automatically, but you can also kind of control it a little bit. And what we'll talk about and kind of show in real, I think in some real practical use case, is what happens when you start to use NVMe expansion cards. Because that's really where bifurcation comes in. That's really the only scenario people are really gonna see bifurcation have a huge impact on their system. And that's for people that are just running lots and lots of storage. But for the general consumer, especially if you're building a gaming system, I highly recommend trying to budget and allocate for the largest SSD that you can afford in the generation that your board supports in its direct to CPU lanes. So for me, on AMD, that would be either doing like a 2 terabyte direct to CPU for Gen 5, and then maybe an expansion drive that's slower or lower gen for your overflow, like on your 4X that's available to the CPU in Gen 4 or less. And then obviously your graphics card is fine. On Intel, don't even bother with a Gen 5 if you're not on Core Ultra. And then obviously put the biggest single drive that you can afford in there for obvious reasons, because the second drive is gonna immediately steal lanes from the PCI Express slot for your GPU. Hopefully this has cleared up some of that. I even did a quick search a second ago, and there's still a lot of people posting with confusion about PCI Express allocation and what it means, and what is bifurcation, and what is Gen 5, and it just confuses a lot of people. Fortunately though, like I said, you're not cutting your performance in half if you cut the bandwidth to the slot in half by going from 16x to 8x. You are leaving some performance on the table depending on your graphics card, but it's not that bad yet. It might get worse in the future though. All right guys, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.